f2 with queen e1. And a very important maneuver that we'll see throughout this video is the maneuver knight d1, knight e3. If a white knight gets to e3, all of the pressure is basically gone. So maybe you start with something like rook b1 and then knight d1. Okay, so after b4, black actually has two interesting moves. Queen d4 is what I consider the main move and what was played in the game, but I also want to briefly mention the alternative bishop takes b4 and go a little bit deeper into that critical position, right? Bishop takes, knight c3, queen d4, g takes, bishop c5, castles, castles, and queen e1. So here, I looked at a few moves. There are also quite a few games in the database, but one move that stood out to me was bishop to f5. And of course here, white is going to play rook b1, preparing knight d1, knight e3. And I really didn't see a good way for black to stop this. For example, maybe knight c4, so that after knight d1, black could play rook a d8 and put pressure on d2. But it turns out that after a move like bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, white can simply play rook b3, and the rook on b1 can swing over to the king side. And all the tactics work out beautifully for white. After rook b3, there's no queen takes c2 because of rook c3, so the bishop retreats, and now instead of knight e3, which is probably fine, white can even sacrifice the pawn on c2 with rook g3. And the point is that after something like queen takes c2, knight e3, queen takes a2, h6, it's actually white that ends up attacking on the king side. So this is a good illustration of how these kinds of middle games can develop. And of course, if we should ever be able to get our bishop involved in the attack, ideally bishop b2, bishop takes e5, then white's advantage is simply overwhelming. Therefore, the main line, the really critical test against b4, is the move queen d4, which wins an exchange because it threatens mate on f2 as well as the rook on a1. So we have to take the bishop, and after castle kingside, queen takes a1 and knight c3. So what does white have for the exchange? Well, at first glance, a pawn and better coordination, right? This queen on a1 and knight on a5 do not look particularly well. But also, black's pawn structure is absolutely shattered. There is not a single pawn island that is not weak here. And after what I used to consider to be the main move, h takes g4, I believe black is actually in quite a bit of trouble here. Now, h takes g4 is really inviting white to play the move bishop takes g4. But this is a mistake because black has a beautiful disruptive move, a nice pawn wedge with e3. And the point is that after f takes e3, if rook takes f1, of course we can't take with the queen because the bishop's hanging, so king takes f1, and now after bishop g4, queen g4, our bishop on c1 is hanging. So this move e3 is a very important resource for black. And in fact here after e3, black is doing absolutely fine. If bishop takes c8, e takes f2, and if rook takes f2, rook a takes c8, black has made some major progress here. He's gotten rid of a lot of his weaknesses. He's opened up the position of our king. This queen on a1 is actually a little bit annoying now, pinning the bishop. So it's important to be mindful of this e3 idea. And after h takes g4, there's a fantastic prophylactic move here. And it's almost like a problem-like move. And that is the move rook to e1, preparing bishop takes g4 and taking the teeth out of this pawn wedge with e3. Because now after e3, we can simply go f takes, and black has no way of undermining or control over the back rank. This rook is very important in keeping the a1 queen at bay. So Here, I looked at the position after g3, which is another interesting way of giving back some of the material, and after f takes, bishop to f5, but here, simply after bishop g4, bishop h7, there is no need to worry about the back rank thanks to the presence of the rook on e1, so our queen is free to improve its position. With moves like queen e2, and white is soon going to start creating some very nasty tactical threats of trapping that queen on a1, for example with bishop to a3. So h takes g4 is actually a blunder here because of rook e1. Black should not waste any time and should play e3, and that's what black did. Of course, if f takes e3, we're probably just going to end up transposing to something very similar to what we were just discussing. For example, if king takes, now bishop takes g4, the rook is coming to f8, the bishop on c1 is in trouble, so this is no good. Therefore, we just don't have enough time to take that pawn. Of course, d takes e3 runs into queen takes c3. So white takes on h5. And now we're definitely threatening to take on e3 because there's no bishop takes g4. So black takes on f2. And after rook takes, king takes, bishop to e6. So after bishop to e6, this position has actually been played many times. I was a little bit surprised. This has been played already 42 times. And in 40 of those 42 games, the move bishop a3 was played. Bishop f3 is actually interesting. It's only been played twice, but it's been played by some very strong players, like Grandmasters Zavuk and Stilwagen from the Netherlands. So bishop f3 is definitely something that's worth investigating. I did look a little bit into it, but I actually like the move bishop a3, and I like the endgame that arises. I think after check, king e1, queen takes, bishop takes, this endgame is quite unpleasant for black for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, this knight on a5 is not doing well. And it's not easy to bring back into the game. We might think that, oh, wait a minute, black can just get knight c4 in and the knight is doing great. Well, this is what was played in the game. But it turns out that after bishop c1, this knight is still somewhat dominated, particularly by the pawn on c5. So white is simply going to play pawn to d3. And